We are in beautiful San Francisco, and we are at TCT 2015. A recent meta-analysis of 10 randomized clinical trials demonstrated that long-term DAPT prevents one stent thrombosis, but at the cost of inducing about 2.1 clinically significant episodes of bleeding. It is a challenge. So what we're looking at here is a series of discussions that we've had over the course of the last year or so. Here at TCT, probably one of the big stories is something called Leaders Free, the first randomized clinical trial dedicated to high bleeding risk patients. So in a group that we often haven't seen enrolled in trials, I want to introduce you to a couple of guys. We have Jose Calle Gordo, who is the CEO, and Hans-Peter Stoll, who is an MD and the CMO of Biosensors International Group Limited. First off, good morning. And this is a group of people we don't usually deal with in terms of randomized clinical trials. So back up first, talk about the technology.
Well, BioFreedom is a very unique device because it's the first polymer-free that incorporates no carrier. At the same time, it uses a very specific drug that was designed specifically by Biosensors. It's called Biolimos A9 or BA9, which I think the combination of that makes it very unique to be able to accomplish the technology necessary to treat these patients.
And what's different in this technology?
The basic and maybe most important feature is that due to the unique and favorable features of this drug, the stent does not need a polymer to hold the drug and to improve its transfer to the wall of the artery. And this absence of a polymer is actually the new design feature that enables this unique clinical effect that we are observing with the trial.
Now, in terms of who was enrolled, these are actually high bleeding risk patients, but can you describe them any better in terms of who they were?
Yeah, so first, important to realize is that we know very little about these patients because they have been systematically excluded from a large number of clinical trials before, although they claimed to enroll all comers. So these patients have a number of criteria that make them particularly vulnerable for interventional treatment. They are older, they have additional diseases, they have rhythm abnormalities of the heart and require blood-thinning substances, they may have cancer, they may have had a stroke, and they may pose conditions that make it more dangerous to treat them, particularly more dangerous to give them blood-thinning substances such as dual antiplatelet therapy over an extended period of time.
Now, what's next? This was a pretty positive first result. What's next in terms of where you're going to go with this?
Well, I mean, first of all, if you think that approximately 1 in 5 patients could benefit from this device, this technology, I think our role now as a company is to really make sure that across the world we have the opportunity to offer this patient. So in some regions, like in Europe or some countries in Asia, it's already available. So therefore, it's an opportunity to see how we can communicate these clinical results to the overall population and the medical community. But then subsequently, we have a number of countries where we need to really accelerate the regulatory approval to be able to have also U.S. patients and Chinese patients and Japanese patients benefit from this in the not-so-distant future.
Now, in terms of what I was talking about at the very beginning, that meta-analysis that I mentioned from the April 2015 issue of JACC, the authors noted second-generation DES substantially attenuated the increased risk of stent thrombosis with short DAPT, but the authors warned that the prevention of a single episode of late stent thrombosis will require exposing a greater number of patients with second-generation DES to potentially serious bleeding harm. So you're hoping to avoid some of that with this, with just 30 days of DAPT, correct?
Yes. The balance between exposing a patient to a risk that comes from stent thrombosis versus exposing him to a risk of bleeding is different for different patient sub-entities. For this population we are investigating here, the balance is absolutely in favor of exposing them to the minimal risk of bleeding, meaning they could only receive this dual antiplatelet therapy for a month. And that has limited the therapeutic option for them to receiving a bare metal stent, which we know is an inferior technology with suboptimal efficacy and exposes them to a higher risk of restenosis. Now, with the evidence that is coming from the leaders-free trial, we know that it's not only safe or equally safe to give a biofreedom stent to this population, it's even safer, and it reduces the risk of this population by approximately 30% to experience any of the downside effects of dual antiplatelet therapy, cardiac death, myocardial infarction, and stent thrombosis.
So finally, are you continuing to follow these patients?
The trial follows them out to 2 years. We are now at a 1-year follow-up time point. It means in a year from now we will have longer-term data to characterize how well they are doing.
Terrific. Thank you very much. I appreciate your time this morning. And I also want to remind you that we have a variety of papers being covered here that some are being published in JACC, others in JACC Intervention. Please look around online at JACC for that. For CardioSource World News, I'm Executive Editor Rick McGuire.